Sup, chooms? How y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. So, today's video is for all the proud members of the Dutasteride Master Race, as well as the people who are thinking about joining the Dutasteride Master Race. The reason why it is called the Dutasteride Master Race is for the simple reason that Dutasteride is without a doubt the most effective hair loss treatment available today. Sure, finasteride is also a great treatment, but it is also a mere peasant drug that is not worthy of the Dutasteride Master Race's greatness, and I say that as a finasteride peasant myself. As much as I may love finasteride, and for as grateful as I may be for all the benefits finasteride has given to my life, I cannot deny that in every study comparing dutasteride to finasteride, dutasteride wins in terms of increased hair growth. It's no contest at all, chooms. The Dutasteride Master Race divinity in the hair loss community cannot be denied. The reason for this is simply due to the fact that dutasteride is a more potent blocker of the 5-air isoenzyme that converts testosterone into the trash hormone DHT. Dutasteride at 0.5 milligrams per day will decrease serum DHT levels by about 90%, while finasteride at any dose ranging from 0.2 milligrams per day to 5 milligrams per day will decrease serum DHT levels by about 70%. Dutasteride at 2.5 milligrams per day will decrease serum DHT levels by even more, up to 96%. So 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride is the master race dose even amongst the master race. Most importantly though, dutasteride will also suppress scalp DHT more than finasteride. 0.5 milligrams of dutasteride per day will decrease scalp DHT by 51% versus 41% with finasteride at 5 milligrams per day. And dutasteride at a dose of 2.5 milligrams per day will decrease scalp DHT by a whopping 79%. That is enough suppression to stop androgenetic alopecia in anybody. So there's no question about it. Dutasteride is more powerful than finasteride. It gets its power from its more powerful blockade of the 5-air enzyme that converts the alpha-chad hormone testosterone into the beta-virgin bitch trash hormone DHT. Dutasteride is 3 times more effective at blocking the type 2 5-air isoenzyme compared to finasteride, and it is 100 times stronger at blocking the type 1 5-air isoenzyme than finasteride is. Since the type 2 5-air isoenzyme is the most prevalent isoenzyme in our hair follicles, it is probably the blockade of the type 2 isoenzyme that accounts for most, if not all, of dutasteride's improved efficacy on our hair compared to finasteride. The type 1 isoenzyme isn't really known to play any significant role in hair loss, although it does play a role in sebum production, which may mean that dutasteride could be useful for stopping acne and reducing the greasiness of our skin and our hair. But does this improved efficacy come at any cost? After all, with medicine, oftentimes the more efficacious a drug is, the greater the risk of side effects. That's why Percocet is far more effective than aspirin at stopping pain, even though aspirin is obviously the much safer drug. So you would think that a drug that lowers DHT levels more than finasteride should cause more side effects, right? But on the contrary, dutasteride, as I will soon show you, doesn't have a greater risk of side effects than finasteride. In fact, it is possible the risk of side effects is even lower than the risk with finasteride. So right now, I'm sure someone in the comment section is probably writing something like, "But Kevin, you've said a million times that finasteride can't cause neurological side effects because it doesn't block the type 1 5-air isoenzyme that is in our brain, and that's important for our neurosteroids. But dutasteride does block the type 1 5-air isoenzyme, so it's gotta crush our neurosteroids and give us brain fog, depression, and other neurological side effects, right bro? And since dutasteride lasts for months in the system, that means it must give us post-Dutasteride syndrome, right?" Well, that may seem like it makes sense, but it's not actually what happens with dutasteride. I've even had some people ask me why it is we never hear about post-Dutasteride syndrome. Now, I am sure that if you were to dig really deeply enough, you probably could find some people online who claim that they do have post-Dutasteride syndrome, but why does it seem practically non-existent, when at the same time, post-finasteride syndrome seems to be touted everywhere online? Here's an example. The most anti-finasteride channel on YouTube is probably Moral Medicine. On that channel, people who claim to have post-drug syndromes are frequently interviewed, and as of today, there are 94 videos on the channel. Most of them are about post-finasteride syndrome, but you also see people claiming to have post-SSRI syndrome, post-Accutane syndrome, and even people claiming that saw palmetto and lion's mane mushroom have given them permanent side effects. But how come there isn't even a single video of someone claiming to have post-Dutasteride syndrome? Dutasteride isn't as commonly prescribed as finasteride, but it isn't like it is some sort of obscure drug that nobody has ever heard of. It is actually approved for treating hair loss in other countries like Good Korea, and it is also commonly prescribed off-label for the treatment of androgenetic alopecia in the United States and Europe due to its well-known efficacy as a hair loss treatment. And yet, despite all of that, it seems like almost nobody talks about persistent side effects from dutasteride or even talks about side effects from the drug at all. So how could it be possible that the most potent 5-AR inhibitor in existence has fewer people talking about persistent side effects or even regular side effects than even saw palmetto and lion's mane mushroom, which are basically just foods that have been consumed for thousands of years? It makes no sense at all to me, chooms, so I knew I had to make a video about this. By the way, if the guys who run the Moral Medicine YouTube channel are perchance watching this video, I challenge you guys to get even one person on your show who claims to have post-Dutasteride syndrome. Honestly, I'd be curious if you're able to do it, because it seems strange you have all these people claiming things like saw palmetto and lion's mane mushroom cause all these horrible, irreversible side effects, but you still can't find even one person to come onto your show who claims that dutasteride caused permanent side effects. So that's a challenge to you guys. Let's see if you can actually do it. So let's first look at studies that compare dutasteride to finasteride. It turns out there have been a lot of head-to-head comparisons between dutasteride and finasteride, and I'll link some of those articles below. Like I said, in every single study that has ever been published, dutasteride beats out finasteride in causing hair growth. But surprisingly, despite its improved efficacy, the studies also show that dutasteride does not cause more side effects than finasteride. So when there are multiple studies looking at the same question, the best way to analyze those studies is to do a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is literally the highest level of scientific evidence that exists, and fortunately, we do have a meta-analysis that was published just this year. It is this article here from Egypt. The article found 9 well-done studies that compare dutasteride with finasteride. Here's a list of the studies that were included. So, the first and most important result of this meta-analysis was that, like I said, dutasteride at doses of 0.5 milligrams per day and at 2.5 milligrams per day was significantly superior to finasteride at 1 milligram per day in increasing hair counts. So, there's no doubt about it here, chums. The more you can suppress your DHT levels, the better your hair grows. But it is the second result of this meta-analysis that is especially surprising to me, and that is the fact that despite dutasteride lowering serum DHT by at least 20% more than finasteride, the incidence of side effects overall was no different from finasteride. So this proves that the side effects from 5-AR inhibiting drugs have nothing to do with lowering DHT levels, because if they did, then dutasteride would obviously have more side effects than finasteride since it suppresses more DHT, but it doesn't. The side effects from 5-AR inhibiting drugs are due to other factors, which I cover in great detail in my video on side effects, which I'll link below. But the bottom line here is that lower DHT levels does not mean more side effects. But admittedly, there is one study, only one, where the incidence of side effects was actually higher on dutasteride compared to finasteride. It's this study here from Good Korea. It is a relatively small study with only 31 men enrolled. They were men who had not responded well to finasteride at 1 milligram per day. As expected, dutasteride at 0.5 milligrams per day markedly improved hair density and hair thickness after 24 weeks of treatment. But the incidence of side effects in this one small study was higher with dutasteride than with finasteride. The authors of the study mentioned the possibility that this increased incidence of side effects compared to other trials might be due to what they call a placebo effect, but what they're actually thinking about is a nocebo effect. The authors speculate that the subjects in this study were primed to expect more side effects from dutasteride since it is a stronger drug than finasteride. Given the fact that it has been scientifically proven that informing subjects that a drug can cause sexual side effects actually causes an increase in sexual side effects, this could be responsible for the relatively higher incidence of sexual side effects in this very small study. So I know the anti-finasteride mob gets really upset whenever you bring up the nocebo effect, but it has been clinically proven to exist with 5-AR inhibitors. So tough shit. Facts don't care about your feelings. In any case, the study is an outlier, and in fact, we have other studies like this one here that suggest that the side effects may even be lower on dutasteride than on finasteride. So, getting back to the meta-analysis, the authors concluded that dutasteride was superior to finasteride in increasing hair counts and hair thickness, while at the same time, dutasteride did not have a greater risk of side effects than finasteride. Just to add to the overwhelming evidence that dutasteride is at least as safe as finasteride, if not safer, there is also a meta-analysis of studies where patients took finasteride or dutasteride for treating benign prostatic hyperplasia. The article looked at 6 studies that included 2,041 subjects, and it came to the same conclusion as the meta-analysis we just covered on subjects taking 5-AR inhibitors for hair loss. The 2 drugs have a similar risk of side effects, including sexual side effects. What makes this data so important is because men with benign prostatic hyperplasia are in general older than men who are taking these drugs for hair loss. Older men are more likely to have decreased libido and erectile dysfunction to begin with. Yet, even in this group of older men, dutasteride did not increase the risk of sexual side effects compared to finasteride. But so far, the studies have looked mostly at sexual side effects, but there is data on neurological side effects too. Here's a study that compared the risk of suicide in finasteride users versus dutasteride users. The study notes that there is not a lot of data on the risk of suicide in men taking dutasteride, but the studies that do exist suggest that there is no increased risk. So, the study used data from the French National Health System, and it compared 69,786 subjects taking finasteride to 217,577 subjects taking dutasteride. These were all men taking these drugs for benign prostatic hyperplasia, and all the men were over 50 years old. The results did not show a difference in the rate of suicide between men taking the 2 different drugs. The risk of suicide attempts was 0.07% with finasteride versus 0.06% with dutasteride, which was not statistically significant. As far as the risk of successful suicides resulting in death goes, the risk was 0.03% with finasteride versus 0.02% with dutasteride. Once again, this was not statistically significant. This is also not statistically different from the risk of suicide-related deaths in the general population, which according to the NIH was for men was 22.8 cases out of 100,000 in 2021, which works out to be an incidence of 0.02%. Now, there was no control group in this study, but you could still easily conclude that dutasteride, despite its greater type 1 5-AR enzyme blocking ability and its greater potency in reducing DHT, did not increase the risk of neurological side effects when compared with finasteride. The authors of the study speculate that this may have something to do with dutasteride not crossing the blood-brain barrier, but this is something that is not quite as clear-cut as the authors point out. So that brings us to the difficult question. Why doesn't dutasteride increase the risk of side effects, and specifically, why doesn't it cause neurological side effects? Remember, dutasteride doesn't even have depression listed as a side effect in its package insert. The reason I keep talking about dutasteroid's effect on the type 1 5-AR isoenzyme is because the type 1 5-AR isoenzyme is the predominant 5-AR isoenzyme in the brain. So if dutasteride crossed the blood-brain barrier into the brain, you would expect that it might cause neurological side effects. However, like we just saw, there is no clinical evidence that this is true. So what's going on here? Well, one reason why dutasteride might not have any neurological side effects could be related to whether it actually does cross the blood-brain barrier. It might cross it completely, or just partially, or not at all even. Some papers state confidently that it does cross the blood-brain barrier, while others are much more cautious. But even the papers that claim it does cross the blood-brain barrier don't really show any actual proof that it does. For example, this paper here confidently claims that both finasteride and dutasteride do cross the blood-brain barrier, yet of the 2 references for the statement that the paper gives, the first one doesn't even mention dutasteride at all because it was a study that was just done on finasteride. And the second reference is from our good friend Dr. Trash. Yet, even Dr. Trash, God bless him, only says that finasteride crosses the blood-brain barrier and never says that dutasteride can cross the blood-brain barrier. So this is a great example of how misinformation gets passed along in the scientific literature. The article quotes 2 studies that don't support at all the statement that dutasteride crosses the blood-brain barrier, yet you see crap like this get quoted on Reddit all the goddamn time. As for my opinion, well, it's not clear to me if dutasteride crosses the blood-brain barrier. However, there is some reason to believe that maybe it can't cross the blood-brain barrier. That's because dutasteride is a bigger molecule than finasteride, and it turns out that the size of the molecule is very, very important for whether or not it can cross the blood-brain barrier. This is the same reason why there is no good evidence that topical dutasteride in a pure form works either, since it is possible that the molecule is also too big to penetrate the skin, although more research is needed on this admittedly. As for cross crossing the blood-brain barrier is concerned, though, the molecular weight of dutasteride is 528 grams per mole, while the molecular weight of finasteride is just 372 grams per mole. According to studies like this one here, the upper limit of molecular size that can cross the blood-brain barrier is a molecular weight between 400 and 600 grams per mole. So it looks like dutasteride might be able to cross the blood-brain barrier, but it is at the upper limit of being able to do so, so it's not clear to what degree, if at all, the blood-brain penetration actually happens with dutasteride. So one explanation for the lack of neurological side effects for dutasteride is that it just doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier at all, or if it does, it only does so to an insignificant degree. This is possible, but it's just not known for certain yet, chums. No one has bothered to measure dutasteride levels in the brain or in the spinal fluid, and I still think research needs to be done on that. Another possible explanation, and one that I think might be the most valid, is that even though dutasteride is 100 times stronger at blocking the type 1 5-air isoenzyme than finasteride, it may still be too weak to cause any significant reduction in neurosteroid levels. That's because even with its 100 times stronger type 1 isoenzyme blockade, dutasteride can't be considered a very strong blocker of the type 1 5-air isoenzyme. If we look at a study that compared the potency of dutasteride for the two main 5-air isoenzymes, we can see clearly that dutasteride is actually a much stronger type 2 5-air isoenzyme blocker than it is a type 1 5-air isoenzyme blocker. We know this because there is a metric called IC50. IC50 is the drug concentration that inhibits 50% of the activity of an enzyme. You can measure IC50 and use it to compare the potency of different drugs. The lower the IC50, the greater the potency of the drug. Anyways, the IC50 of dutasteride for the type 1 5-air isoenzyme is 0.7 nanomoles, while the IC50 for the type 2 5-air isoenzyme is much lower at 0.05 nanomoles. If you do the math, that means that dutasteride is 14 times stronger at blocking the type 2 5-air isoenzyme than it is at blocking the type 1 5-air isoenzyme. So even though dutasteride is 100 times stronger at blocking the type 1 5-air isoenzyme than finasteride is, that doesn't mean that dutasteride is a strong type 1 5-air blocker. That also implies that finasteride's effect on the type 1 5-air isoenzyme isn't just small, it's completely insignificant. So even being 100 times stronger at blocking the type 1 5-air isoenzyme than finasteride is, dutasteride is still a relatively weak type 1 blocker. So even if dutasteride does cross the blood-brain barrier, it's possible its effects on the type 1 5-air isoenzyme are still far too weak to cause any neurological side effects. And we don't even have to speculate about this because we even have clinical evidence that dutasteride is not a potent enough type 1 5-air inhibitor to have any effects on neurosteroids. To show this, we have this article here that looked at the effect of dutasteride on serum allopregnanolone levels in women with premenstrual syndrome. The study looked at two doses of dutasteride, a dose of 0.5 milligrams per day and a dose of 2.5 milligrams per day. It turns out that the standard dose of dutasteride, which is 0.5 milligrams per day, had no effect on serum allopregnanolone levels at all. In fact, the levels actually went up on that dose during the menstrual cycle. However, the high dose of dutasteride at 2.5 milligrams per day did slightly decrease serum allopregnanolone levels during the menstrual cycle. But remember, chums, this is just serum allopregnanolone levels we're talking about here. We don't know what effect dutasteride had on brain allopregnanolone levels in these women, which is pretty important because just like with DHT, allopregnanolone is a paracrine hormone that works locally where it is produced, meaning the brain. But the point I'm trying to make here is that one reason why dutasteride doesn't affect neurological function is that it is just too weak of a type 1 5-air blocker at the usual dose for hair loss, which is 0.5 milligrams per day. Now, you may think that in theory, using 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride per day might have some effects on neurosteroid synthesis, but there is no clinical evidence proving this, and I have never heard of anyone claiming to get depression on 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride. Usually it's quite the opposite since they're elated that they have so much new hair regrowth. Even at 2.5 milligrams per day though, the effect on neurosteroid synthesis is likely to be clinically insignificant. But still, we haven't yet answered the question. Why is it that we hear about post-finasteride syndrome, post-Saul Palmetto syndrome, post-lion's mane syndrome, or post-whatever the fuck you can imagine syndrome, yet we never hear about post-Dutasteride syndrome? Well, what finasteride-hating goons will likely tell you is that is because fewer men take dutasteride than finasteride. This is undoubtedly true. Comparing the data available for number of prescriptions for both drugs in the United States, it looks like there are about 8 times as many finasteride prescriptions as dutasteride prescriptions. But keep in mind here, finasteride is one of the most widely prescribed drugs in the entire world. So even having 8 times fewer prescriptions, we're still talking about over 1 million prescriptions of dutasteride written per year, and that is just in the United States alone. So we're still talking about millions of dutasteride users, and even if there are only 1/8 as many users of dutasteride as there are of finasteride, there would still be plenty of reports of post-Dutasteride syndrome if it really existed. So I don't think you can explain the lack of people claiming to have post-Dutasteride syndrome just from the number of people who are prescribed dutasteride versus finasteride. I'm not saying that there exist no cases of people claiming it at all. I'm sure some exist, but at the very least, we'd see at least 1/8 of the number of people claiming persistent side effects from 5-AR inhibitors to be dutasteride users. But again, if you look at the Moral Medicine YouTube channel, which interviews people who claim to have post-drug syndromes, not a single one of them is a former dutasteride user, even though we have people on that channel claiming that Saul Palmetto and lion's mane mushroom cause them permanent sexual and neurological side effects. However, I think there is another better explanation for why we constantly hear about post-finasteride syndrome, but we never hear about post-dutasteride syndrome. I think a lot of this is because there is less social contagion around dutasteride online than there is for finasteride. That's because in the early 2000s, post-marketing surveys by the FDA identified a grand total of 53 cases of side effects attributed to finasteride that lasted more than 3 months after stopping the drug. Because of this, the possibility of persistent side effects as well as depression were added to the package label for finasteride, even though the FDA said at the same time that there was no supporting scientific evidence proving that these problems were related to finasteride. Meanwhile, there were several prominent human interest reports published in the media of people who were supposedly harmed by finasteride to the point of committing suicide. While that was all happening, thousands of websites sprung up with reports claiming that finasteride caused irreparable harm, and there were numerous lawsuits filed against Merck. Merck's attempt to deal with this issue by awarding large settlements didn't help them at all. It made matters worse, in fact, and I talk about all this in my video on finasteride and lawsuits, which I'll link below. But the point is that everyone talks about post-finasteride syndrome, and there is even a post-finasteride syndrome network that funds anti-finasteride studies. So the PFS industrial complex grinds on, churning out anecdotes after anecdotes about PFS and flawed studies with selection bias issues, and it is a self-perpetuating process. There are positive feedback loops here, chums. People read about all these awful side effects from finasteride, and that creates the perfect conditions to have a nocebo effect. Then those people who have the nocebo effect will write about how awful finasteride is, and the process continues indefinitely. Meanwhile, dutasteride never had the high-profile media coverage or the lawsuits that finasteride had, and we could judge from the scientific studies of dutasteride that we went over today that the risk of side effects is low, maybe even lower than the risk of side effects from finasteride, despite the fact that dutasteride is a more efficacious hair loss drug. So what can we take away from all of this, chums? Well, number one, it's okay to join the dutasteride master race if you want to. You are not going to increase your risk of side effects from dutasteride compared to finasteride. Number two, it's even possible that some people who do get side effects on finasteride will tolerate dutasteride better. It's hard to explain exactly how that could be, but some studies do show a lower incidence of side effects with dutasteride than with finasteride. Lastly, another thing you can try if you are still on the fence about joining the master race is to use both finasteride and dutasteride together. You could try using dutasteride once or twice per week with finasteride on the other days, and you can see if you get any additional benefits from dutasteride. This is something I would recommend to people who are already responding well to finasteride, but are just curious to see if the additional DHT suppression gives them any more benefits. Generally speaking though, if you are already on finasteride and getting good results, you probably don't need to switch to dutasteride. Finasteride, even though it is a peasant drug, will still stop hair loss in the vast majority of people, and as a finasteride peasant myself, I can confidently say that my experience with the drug has been a very good one. And it's not as if finasteride doesn't have any benefits over dutasteride. Finasteride is the cheaper drug after after all, especially if you get generic 5 milligram Proscar tablets and cut the pills into quarters to get roughly the standard dose. Also, finasteride doesn't contain any gelatin, which is especially important for vegan soy boys like myself, or for people who don't consume pig products due to spiritual reasons. So, whether you choose the dutasteride master race, or you'd rather just be a finasteride peasant like me, the fact remains is that both drugs are fantastic treatments that will stop and reverse hair loss in the vast majority of people. So, what's important here is not which one you choose, but just choosing one to begin with. Regardless though, whichever one you choose, you can rest assured that you're doing the best possible thing you can do to save your hair and to improve your life. So, thank you for watching Hair Loss Witchers. I'll see you all next time. God bless.